Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this month's Black History Series presentation titled Reparative Description, Confronting Anti-Blackness in Archives with Archives of Ontario archivist Melissa J. Nelson. Melissa J. Nelson is an archivist, writer, and educator based in Toronto, Ontario. Her work and research interests include the preservation of Black cultural heritage and ethics of care in the preservation of anti-Black archival materials. Melissa has been recognized for her expertise in anti-Black or anti-racist archival practice. She is a recipient of the 2023 Association of Canadian Archivists New Professional Award and Ancestry Award. Melissa is currently an archivist for the Archives of Ontario. She holds a Bachelor of Arts honors in history with a minor in sociology from Carleton University. She has also completed a Master's of Information Studies at McGill University. Very impressive. Before we begin, I would just ask that everyone, if you could please turn off your cameras and your microphones, just so that it doesn't distract our speaker. Following her presentation, there will be a question and answer period. So you can just type your questions in the comment section, or you can raise your hand and I will call on you. At this point, you're absolutely welcome to turn on your camera and your microphone again. And just one final note, if you would like to support programming such as our Black History series, you can go to our website to make a donation. It's amherstburgfreedom.org. And now I'm going to turn it over to Melissa. Thank you so much for being here today.
I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction, and hello, everyone. First, I would just like to thank the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for inviting me to speak today. As it was mentioned in my introduction, I am currently an archivist at the Archives of Ontario. More specifically, I work in the Collections Development and Management Unit. So in this unit, we work directly with the collection, and we are responsible for the appraisal, acquisition, description, and access of the documentary memory of the province. Today, I will be talking about reparative description and how this practice has been used to interrupt and repair anti-Blackness in archives. A growing number of archives have been undertaking this work, including the Archives of Ontario. I am part of the description remediation team within the Collections Development and Management Unit, and I provide leadership on the remediation of descriptions for anti-Black archival materials. So I'm going to start off by giving an overview of what reparative description is and why it's important. Then I'm going to provide some examples from our archives. And just before I begin, I would like to give a content warning. This talk will include examples of anti-Black archival materials. These are included in the talk for educational purposes. I encourage you to take space if you need to. While it is potentially upsetting, it's important for us to address these harmful moments in our province's history. So the process to remediate description is known by many names, including reparative description, redescription, critical cataloging, and inclusive description, just to name a few. Regardless of the name, they have a similar goal in mind. According to the Society of American Archivists, reparative description is the, quote, remediation of practices or data that exclude, silence, harm, or mischaracterize marginalized people and the data created or used by archivists to identify or characterize archival resources, end quote. In other words, reparative description is about bringing legacy descriptions, which are archival descriptions that were written in the past, bringing them in line with current best practices, with a focus on improving descriptions of marginalized people in an effort to achieve social justice. The aim is to create archival descriptions that are accurate, inclusive, and community-centered. Description is iterative work as descriptive language preferences and needs change over time, and we as archivists are constantly learning appropriate ways to describe. The Archives of Ontario description policy states that, quote, archival description is a continuous intellectual endeavor. It must be responsive to new understandings of records and context, and to changes in values, professional practices, and the needs of record creators, donors, users, subjects, and communities. Respectful language evolves over time, and archivists unavoidably make errors in describing records. To address these issues, archivists must take responsibility for past descriptive decisions and acknowledge that no description is ever final. Archival description must follow a flexible, iterative approach, end quote. So why does this matter? The voices of marginalized people are often missing from the historical record. Archivists have made decisions over time about who and what is deemed important enough to preserve. This has created gaps and silences in collections, with the experiences of marginalized groups largely being told through the lens of dominant groups. Also, the traditional use of so-called neutral language and legacy descriptions has resulted in harmful descriptive practices. Legacy descriptions often contain outdated, culturally insensitive, or even offensive terminology. In other cases, legacy descriptions ignore, silence, and invisibilize communities who are represented or affected by the record. These descriptions often use language that serve to aggrandize record creators. Individual and institutional biases influence the way records are described. By using neutral language, legacy descriptions can also reproduce and reinforce existing power structures. Neutral language can give legitimacy to harmful narratives and endorse problematic materials as normal. This has caused further harm to marginalized communities and contributed to mistrust in archival institutions. Reparative description is restorative and liberating. It interrupts harmful narratives and practices in archives. Remediation involves revising descriptions to include respectful and more accurate language. This improves discoverability by allowing marginalized communities to locate records using the language they use to describe themselves. Reparative description provides context and uses clear and direct language to acknowledge the experiences of marginalized groups and ensure the transparency and accountability of record creators and archival institutions. Reparative description is an ethics of care that aims to recover and excavate the existence of marginalized groups in the archives and recognize their humanity. When applied to the representation of Black communities, reparative description can be understood as a form of Black archival practice. Black archival practice calls us to honor Black people of the past and center the needs of Black people in the present and the future. In the post Labors of Love, proposing participatory archival and para-archival practices, Kirill Aminumi et al. Explain that, quote, Black presence in many historic archives is inextricably tied with anti-Blackness, violence, and exclusion. Often we appear in these archives as nameless objects, stripped of our humanity, culture, and dignity, end quote. Archivists play an important role in shaping the way records and subjects of records are understood. So it's important that archivists abandon neutrality and become intentional in how they describe records. In recent years, archivists have been moving away from neutrality to create more inclusive and accurate descriptions. Archivists are recognizing that no archival function is neutral, including description, and that archival processes must be deliberate and conscious acts. There are a number of resources that can be consulted to help archivists understand how to make reparative description part of their practice. In their article, From Human Rights to Feminist Ethics, Radical Empathy in the Archives, Michelle Caswell and Marika Siffer encourage archivists to adopt an empathetic approach to description and use what they call radical empathy at every point of the archival process. They define radical empathy as the ability to understand and appreciate another person's feelings and experiences. They explain that empathy is radical in the archival realm if, quote, we allow it to define archival interactions even when our own visceral affective responses are steeped in fear, disgust, or anger, end quote. The article encourages archivists to center implicated communities and ask themselves questions such as, what are the consequences of my decisions on the larger community? And is the descriptive language I am using respectful to the larger communities of people invested in this record? Charlotte Lohman encourages archivists to think critically and approach description work with an equity mindset. In the Resource Guidelines for Inclusive and Conscientious Description, Lohman asks archivists to consider questions such as what role can your words have in either perpetuating or combating marginalization and archival erasure, and who is harmed and who benefits from your description, as well as in the interest of clarity and equity, what should be brought to the forefront to appropriately contextualize the record. To describe offensive materials appropriately, archivists should be clear and direct in their use of language. The Anti-Racist Description Resource by Archives for Black Lives in Philadelphia Anti-Racist Description Working Group provides detailed recommendations for addressing anti-Black racism in description. The resource states that archivists should unlearn the use of neutral and passive language in description. This resource encourages archivists to, quote, use accurate and strong language, such as lynching, rape, murder, and hate mail when they are appropriate. Equally important, the resource urges archivists to not let their discomfort with problematic content censor the material. Archivists should describe relationships of power to provide context to records and assign responsibility in the description. This includes using terms such as enslaver, hate group, and racist to clearly identify the actions of the record creators and acknowledge offensive content in the records. Archivists should use compassion in description practices and make use of person-first language. For example, when describing slavery, people who are held in bondage should be described as enslaved or captive rather than slaves. The terms enslaved and captive make it clear that slavery was an imposed state. It describes Black people who were held in bondage as human first. So how do we do this? At the Archives of Ontario, our description remediation team completed an audit to identify outdated and offensive terminology that can be found in our descriptions. This language may originate from the creators of records, previous stewards, or archive staff. These descriptions are currently being located and remediated to provide respectful and more accurate language. We are correcting descriptions that have omitted information about the record creator's slaveholding in the biographical sketch. We are also revisiting descriptions with valorizing language that have assigned importance to the record creators. These descriptions tend to elevate and privilege wealthy white men. Remediated descriptions will instead avoid value judgments and focus on information that is important for understanding the records. When harmful language is derived from the record creator, we work to contextualize it and distinguish it from archivist-supplied language. This is achieved through the use of quotation marks, square brackets, or descriptive notes. When we encounter problematic language that was written by staff, we update it. As part of our remediation practices, we capture a copy of the existing description. Captured descriptions can be requested by users and used to understand our past practices. Preserving existing descriptions is important to not erase our own harmful practices as archivists. As we remediate, we consider whether the description requires a content warning to prepare users for engaging with the record. In our remediated descriptions, we are transparent with our users as we document our changes, the rationale, the date, and how to access previous versions of the description. These steps are outlined in our description policy, which guides this work. So reparative description at the Archives of Ontario is relatively new and it's ongoing. We recently migrated to a new collections management system called Archives and Information Management Systems, or AIMS. We have had countless issues with the system, including issues with how it searches, sorts, and displays descriptions on the front and the back end. Despite this, we have been able to upload several remediated descriptions. So I'm going to show you a few examples of these so you can understand what our work looks like in practice. When dealing with records that contain outdated or offensive content, it's important to contextualize it. Without context in the description, these records can be misinterpreted by the public. This is a description for a blackface record that was made available through our GLAM wiki page. This description uses clear language to acknowledge harm and relationships of power. It states, quote, "This photograph depicts instances of blackface, a practice that is racist and perpetuates prejudice that might be upsetting," end quote. Users are also alerted to the presence of this material at the collections level. The context in this description is useful because the harm blackface has and continues to cause in producing and normalizing racist stereotypes about Black people is not well understood. Providing this information also acknowledges the existence of anti-Black racism in Canada. In terms of using subject headings to tag records, Library of Congress subject headings is widely used by libraries and archives. However, it is well known to contain outdated, inappropriate, and offensive terms. Library of Congress subject headings is also written with the presumption of whiteness and maleness in its default term. Archivists should consider if the subject heading term they use is harmful to the communities that are represented or impacted by the records. Archivists should also consider how the subject terms shape the way users discover and understand the record. If a more respectful descriptor is used, archivists should reflect on how it may affect discoverability. At the Archives of Ontario, we make use of Library of Congress subject headings when it is appropriate. We use in-house subject headings when Library of Congress subject headings does not represent communities or events accurately, respectfully, or to sufficient level of detail. This is a description for a photograph in our collection that depicts members of the Ku Klux Klan. The description uses the subject term racism. Including the subject term makes it clear to users that the record contains racist content. It also clearly identifies the actions of the record subjects. Using the subject term improves discoverability for scholars who are studying and evaluating racism. This screenshot captures the back end of our previous descriptive database. Subject terms are not available on our current collections management system, but we plan to include it in future iterations. When archivists encounter racist terminologies in titles, it's important that they maintain original language to accurately convey historical attitudes and preserve the context of the record creation. Removing offensive elements sanitizes the truth about our past. Removing offensive language can also negatively impact discoverability. Because of archival taxonomy and descriptive practices, Black scholars often have to search for Black life in the archives by using derogatory terminologies. When racist language is maintained, the Anti-Racist Description resource recommends that archives contextualize and clearly distinguish racist language from archivist supplied description. This can minimize the trauma Black scholars experience when doing this work. Our description policy outlines procedures for describing records that contain upsetting or harmful content. The policy states that when harmful creator-supplied language is present, it should be maintained, and respectful, community-preferred language should be added in square brackets. So this example follows that model. As you can see, the original title uses a racial slur. We created a supplied title in square brackets that uses community-preferred language to describe these circus workers. By adding a supplied title, we created a description that is respectful to the Black community. This method also allows Black scholars to locate records using respectful terminologies. Archives should be mindful of the language they use to identify and describe communities that are represented in their collections. Archival descriptions should reflect the language communities use to describe themselves and their experiences. Archives can learn preferred language through community consultation or collaboration. There are also community-generated resources that can be consulted to understand preferred language. To describe records that relate to slavery, consulted with a community-generated resource writing about slavery, teaching about slavery, This Might Help, which was compiled by P. Gabriel Foreman, who is a professor of African American Studies and History at Penn State University. This resource is quite helpful as it suggests language to consider avoiding and adopting when describing slavery. In addition to this, we shared our descriptions with Natasha Henry Dixon, who is an assistant professor of African Canadian history at York University. She gave us feedback on our choice of language and helped us understand how Black scholars navigate the archives. This description was remediated to replace outdated language that was used by our staff. The term fugitive slave was replaced with the term freedom seeker. This shift in language changes the way this individual is viewed and understood. The term fugitive slave indicates that escaping slavery was a criminal act. It reflects the perspectives and values of slaveholding society. While the term freedom seeker is empowering, it honors the agency and humanity of enslaved people. It illustrates the decision enslaved people made to take control of their destiny from those who enslaved them. The original language was maintained and placed in quotation marks and brackets to improve discoverability. To enhance the findability of our remediated descriptions, we recently updated our resources relating to Black history at the Archives of Ontario to include a list of keywords that can be used when searching for records in our collection that reference or depict Black people. This provides scholars with some guidance so they don't have to speculate which terms are used in our archives. This also allows Black scholars to search for records in our collection using community-preferred and self-identifying language. We are in the process of creating a Black history research guide that will expand on this resource. As I previously mentioned, Black people often appear unnamed in archives. In some cases, record creators would refer to Black people as derogatory terms like Negro, Negress, or the N-word, rather than refer to them by name. The process of naming and unnaming was the record creator's way of signifying importance. Archivists should make a conscious effort to record the names race, and ethnicity of marginalized people who are represented in their collection. Providing these details improves discoverability and restores the dignity of the record subjects. If this information is unknown to the archivist, they can add a note in the description asking users to share information that can improve or correct the description. This is the title for a photograph that was made available through our Flickr page. As you can see, the original title does not name the subjects of the photograph. The record creator refers to one of the subjects as a Negro while ignoring the presence of his wife. We created a supply title in square brackets to identify both people in the photograph and use community-preferred language to describe their race. This approach both humanizes Black subjects of records and renders Black lives visible in our archives. Archives need to consider ways they can minimize harm when describing and providing access to offensive materials. This can be achieved through flagging harmful content, by adding a note in the description, or by creating a collection guide. Content warnings allow users to mentally prepare for engaging with a record and decide for themselves if they wish to view it. This is a content warning for a poster in our collection. The content warning begins in the title field to alert users before they engage with the record. In the notes field, more context is provided. This description recognizes that this record contains offensive language and explains why it is maintained. It reads, quote, "This poster contains the term pickaninny, which is an anti-Black racist slur used to refer to Black children. The record has been maintained to present and preserve the historical attitudes of the record's creator," end quote. The note then directs users to our statement addressing anti-Black racist content on the Archives of Ontario montage wall to learn more about our efforts to create a safe and welcoming reading room environment. To actively address racism and other forms of discrimination in archival description, archives should articulate their position on offensive materials. The Anti-Racist Description resource asks archives to be transparent about their efforts to address discrimination and publish an online statement outlining principles and goals. In these statements, archives should hold their institutions accountable by acknowledging problematic language and legacy descriptions, and provide guidelines for how they are addressing offensive language and content in their descriptions. Several archives have published public statements to address offensive materials in their collections. Many of these statements were issued in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020. Calls for a racial reckoning prompted archivists to think deeper about historic and current practices. So this is our statement on language and description that is available to read on our website. This statement centers impacted communities by acknowledging the harm these communities face. It states, quote, "The Archives of Ontario collects records and other materials related to all aspects of the history of the place we now call Ontario. This sometimes includes materials that document past and continuing injustices and violence, offensive or harmful attitudes and behaviors, and records of a personally or culturally sensitive nature. Archives of Ontario staff describe these materials to make them accessible to the public. We strive to provide access to items in our collection in a way that respects human dignity, responds to individual and community needs, and complies with legislation such as the Canadian Copyright Act, and the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. At the same time, we believe it is important for difficult aspects of Ontario's history to be documented, accessible, and known, so that individuals and institutions, including the Archives of Ontario, may be held accountable for their actions, end quote. As we engage in reparative description work, it is a learning process. Archives should adopt a growth mindset and welcome feedback from users on their description and access practices. This should be made clear and visible online. Feedback can be gathered through a form, a comment section, or through providing direct contact information. On our website, we are transparent with our users and about our descriptive practices, and we welcome feedback. Our statement reads, quote, "Our databases contain descriptions that have been created over several decades. Many descriptions of archival records and other materials may contain language that is now considered outdated and/or harmful. Staff are currently reviewing the databases and working to amend and add context to the language used in descriptions. The Archives of Ontario recognizes and acknowledges that the description of archival records and other historical materials is ultimately a matter of interpretation, not a neutral or objective activity. Individual members of staff seek to provide an accurate and useful representation of the materials they describe. But their work is inevitably influenced by their own worldviews, life experiences, education, values, interests, and identity, among other factors. We invite and welcome your feedback," end quote. As archivists, we are constantly learning and finding ways to improve our practice. Our hope is that in sharing these records and their context, we provide an accurate representation of the province's history, encourage critical assessment of our records, and spark scholarship and discussion for a more respectful and liberated future. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a really powerful and extremely instructive presentation. Thank you so much for that. If anyone has any questions, you can either raise your hand or you can put it in the comment section. It's up to you. You can all turn on your cameras too and your mics if you want now as well. I guess while we're waiting for our audience to ask a question, I was just wondering, you'd mentioned about how there's going to be a Black History research guide that's going to be available eventually. Now, I understand that that is probably going to take some time to do, but do you anticipate it will be several years from now that guide will be available to the public, or do you have like a time frame? I'm curious because I would love to see something like that for your collection.
Yeah, I don't have a time frame. I am writing the research guide, and I did start it. I think it's just going to take me several months to complete it, but I wouldn't say it would take a few years.
Oh, that's exciting to hear.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Please feel free to, when it is available, I would love to share that on our social media pages so people can access that as well.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? Well, I guess I can also ask as well too. I mean, we know the Alvin McCurdy Fond is, I would consider it, to me at least, the most important Black history collection in our country. I think it's such a massive collection created by Alvin McCurdy. Is that where you started to look at the language that is used, or is it outside of that collection that you're looking at the text?
Well, this work started with an audit just to understand what is present in our collection, and if there's offensive language present, if there's outdated language present, if there's valorizing language present, and just getting an understanding for which collections we need to look deeper at. The Alvin D. McCurdy collection some of it was remediated because the term Negro is present. So just to add context and to help users understand the usage of that word. But it is language that is coming from the community, so that is very different from
Right.
how it's used in other collections.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now, I don't see any other questions in the comment. We just have someone who said thank you so much for this. So I'll just give it another moment if anyone has any questions. And I'm sure if you think of a question after the presentation, I'm sure that Melissa would be more than happy for you to reach out. And also,
Yeah.
I mean, your podcast, I think that sounds fantastic. And I encourage all of you to take a listen to that as well, to learn more. Because as you mentioned, this is just the beginning of changing things for the better. So, so I say thank you so much for everything that you're doing. And I truly do think that, I mean, I know that I've learned a lot today, but I'm sure that our audience has as well too. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Excellent. Okay. Oh, actually, we do have one question that just popped up in the questions, in the comments. Has there been resistance against reparative description?
From our users? No, not as far as I know. I think there was some concern about that. I think some archives are concerned about that. That some people might think of it as like wokeism, and that it's unnecessary and excessive. But I think I hear from, people from marginalized communities that say, thank you so much for doing this work. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. And I see the effort that the archive has put into this. So I would say the response so far is pretty positive.
Excellent. So someone is just typing, I can see them typing in a comment or question. So I'm just going to let them type that in. Okay, perfect. Question. Oh, so that question is for me, actually. Will the recording of this talk be available? So yes, thank you so much for asking. Yes, this is recorded and we're going to be posting it onto our YouTube page and our Facebook page as well. So it will definitely be accessible. We want as many people to learn about this incredibly important subject as possible. So thank you for your question. And yes, it will be available on our YouTube page. Just type in Amherstburg Freedom Museum on YouTube or go to our Facebook page, Amherstburg Freedom. Oh, and you're welcome. And someone is still typing a comment, so we'll just give them a moment to type that in. If anyone wants to say a question, you can, of course, turn on your microphone and go ahead and ask that as well. There's others clapping in, doing the clap emoji in the comments as well. So thank you for that. Okay, so another question. Are there similar descriptive practices in place for exhibits, say description of photographs, documents, and so on?
Are you referring to like museums and art galleries?
They are just typing the follow-up to that.
I just want to be sure that I understand the question.
Yeah, of course. No, that makes total sense. Okay. Let's see. So they put more exhibits that the Ontario Archives might do, say a display of historic photographs tied to an event.
And when it comes to us displaying materials in, say, our reading room or our exhibit spaces, we include things like content warnings. I don't know if we really had that many situations where this would have come up, but more recently, we did have an exhibit that's about the Sir George Williams affair. That was a protest of anti-Black racism for a university that is now Concordia University. And some of the materials that were included in the exhibit include the use of the N-word because that was used in the counter protests. That was used by counter protesters. Some of them had signs up with the N-word. So when we wanted to display these materials, we had to think about providing context and creating content warnings and where we're going to display this in the reading room so that it gives users the option to engage with this material or not placing it in a way that it forces them to engage with it. So not putting it right alongside the walkway, for example. So that is something that came up recently. So what we did, as I said, is provide context and a content warning.
Excellent. They're just typing. Oh, they said thank you very much. Excellent. So there's no other questions in the comments section. Let's see. Is anyone else? Oh, Mia or Maya, I'm so sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, but you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thanks. Yeah, it's Mia.
Mia,
Thank you for
thank you.
that talk. That was wonderful. I don't know exactly how to phrase this question, but I am a master's student, and my research is on Chinese sex work economies on the West Coast, like in Canada. And something that I encountered in the archives is like the names of my research subjects like constantly being misspelled, like a million different iterations of how to spell one like Chinese name in this case. And so I was wondering like how, yeah, I'm not sure, like, is there a way to kind of grapple with that or mitigate for that, like in descriptive practices? Or yeah, that's kind of more of an open-ended question, but just around naming, you know.
I think something that you can do if you haven't done it already is let those archives know these names are misspelled, and give them the chance to correct it, because whenever those descriptions were created, that person may not have consulted with the community. They may not have understood what the appropriate spelling was. And so I think something that's really important in this work is actually getting help from our users and, them notifying us when we need to actually take a deeper look at certain collections and consider remediating it. So something that archive can do is they can do some consultation with the community. They can reach out to, for example, a scholar or a cultural center and get them to help with the correct spelling. Or if there's variations in spelling, understanding what variations of spelling need to be included in the description so that it's discoverable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's where it's tricky because historically there were so many variations as well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. So that's something that comes up. That's something that has come up for me in redescribing anti-Indigenous records, because they have there's nations that the community refers to themselves a particular way, but historically they were referred to using a different name. And so a researcher from that community might be looking for one or the other terminology in the archive. So you have to think about what's important to actually include in the descriptions that you're improving discoverability.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Excellent. We have just another comment. It says, not a question, just a comment. I appreciate that you named the legislator's wife in a previous slide rather than stating Mr. and Mrs. XXX. So many women of the time were not identified outside of their partner/husband's name. I absolutely agree with that. So
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, I did not remediate that one, but yeah, it's. I think it's great that they chose to say her name as opposed to just saying that she is Leonard Braithwaite's wife. That's so important.
Absolutely. Okay, it looks like that is the end of the questions and comments. So, thank you again so much, Melissa, for being here today and teaching us all. I'm so excited to share this with others. I think this is such an important topic, and I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. And thank you all for the very engaging Q&A session. Love those questions and comments. So
Yeah.
again, thank you so much. And Melissa, I will, if you have any final comments you want to make, I will leave it with you.
Okay. Yeah, if anybody wants to reach out, if they want to speak to me about my work, if they want to come to visit the archives, my contact information is listed on the slide. So feel free to reach out with any questions or suggestions as well.
Excellent. And you're getting a lot of thank yous in the comments section
Yeah,
as
thank
well,
you so
too.
much.
So excellent. So thank you everyone for being with us today. And thank you again so much, Melissa, for giving such an amazing presentation. And everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.